Hi, and welcome to this episode of The Life of Purpose. And in this series, we're looking at the building blocks of faith, those really critical components of who we are and what builds us into followers of Jesus Christ. We've had a lot of people who have asked us over the years who had been leading confirmation to ask us, is there any way that you could put together a series so that we could sort of relearn this? Because we're teaching it to our kids, but we'd forgotten it. And so some of these building blocks are ones that we teach to confirmands in their sixth grade year, almost every year. This particular episode, we're looking at the history of the Methodist Church. But before we can get to the Methodist Church, we're going to go all the way back to the very beginning, which is
Genesis.
Yeah, well, not that far.
Sorry.
It's a very good place to start.
Well,
and so we're going to
pick up wherever you want to.
Okay.
That's fine.
Well, we're going to start with Jesus.
Okay.
And so after Jesus' death, the church continued to grow, and it expanded all around the Mediterranean region. And each area around the Mediterranean sort of developed its own church structure. And so there would be a bishop, say, in Rome, and there would be one in Alexandria in Africa, one in Jerusalem, one in Constantinople, which is today Istanbul. And so there were these major sees, as they called them, with bishops. And but for the first 3 or 4 centuries, there wasn't really a centralized sense of how the church functioned. Mm. And then came Emperor Constantine in the Roman Empire. And it is fascinating and a little bit of it gives you a good feeling that ultimately the church did beat the Roman Empire because eventually the Roman Empire recognized Christianity as a major part of its history and had its first emperor who was Christian. And so Constantine pulled together all of these different church leaders from around the world and said, there's some things we need to work out. Like we need to work out a calendar. When are we going to celebrate Christmas? We know it as December the 25th, but that wasn't established, and people were celebrating Easter here and Christmas there. The creeds, what it exactly is that the church believes or doesn't believe, all of that started coming together. And so the church had a sort of an orthodoxy, as we might say, of what was right belief. And that continued pretty straight on until the year 1054. And at that point, the Roman Empire was falling apart, and the bishop at Constantinople separated from the bishop at Rome. And so we began to see all of what we would call the Orthodox churches, the Greek Orthodox, the Roman Orthodox, a number of others in that area of the world, be very different, or not totally different, but difference in style and in worship and the use of images from the Roman church. The Roman side of the church, the Western Europe, it stayed pretty well intact for another 500 years. And then there was all kind of fracturing. The church, the Roman Catholic Church, was struggling with really its own ethic, with its popes. Popes weren't living up to what they were expected to live up to, and people began to demand reform. And so you saw in Germany people like Martin Luther start the Lutheran Church, and you saw in a place like Switzerland where you have Calvin and Zwingli start churches. In Scotland, the Presbyterian Church is a sort of a spin-off of Calvin. And then in England, you have the Church of England that begins. And you'd like to say it's over theology.
Yeah, not so much.
But it's more because Henry VIII wanted a divorce from his wife. The Pope wouldn't do it. And so he said, I'll just start my own church and grant myself my own divorce, and problem solved. But in the Church of England, that is where we pick up with the story of the Wesleys, because they were members of the Church of England.
Right. Samuel Wesley and Susanna Wesley were living in Epworth, England. And Samuel was the priest of the church in Epworth, and he and Susanna had 19 children across the years. Not all of them lived to adulthood, but they had 19 children. And Samuel was not a very popular priest in Epworth, and he struggled in a lot of ways. He was a very hard man. But two of his children that came along sort of toward the tail end of their having children were two boys, and one born in 1703, John, and then in 1707, Charles. And they would go on to, well, change the world in a way. But it didn't look like it was going to that was going to be possible, because Samuel was so unpopular. The church in Epworth decided that they were going to get rid of Samuel by any means. And so at one point, they set fire to the parsonage in Epworth, and which isn't good.
He still didn't move.
He didn't move. I mean, they had to make a ladder out of people standing on each other's shoulders to get John out of the second story of the burning house to save him. And yet Samuel still didn't leave.
Just to only fathom the strength of personality they did not like, that even when they tried to kill his family, that wasn't going to scare him either.
No, he stayed. And it was really expected that even though life in that parsonage was hard, and life in Epworth was hard with Samuel, Susanna was wonderful, but Samuel was very difficult as a father and as a church leader and all.
And he didn't manage his finances well.
He didn't manage his finances
well. He went to debtor's prison at one point.
Absolutely. He also was political in so many ways. He was very loyal to the king, and he and Susanna would get at odds at different times, and he would leave and then come over issues like that and then come back. It was very hard. But there was an expectation that his sons would follow in the family business. And so one of his oldest sons, Samuel, also named after him, had gone to Oxford, had become a priest in the Church of England. And then John goes to Oxford on the path to be a priest in the Church of England. And after he had finished his studies, he stayed on as a fellow of Lincoln College, and Charles arrived to become a priest in the Church of England. And when Charles got there, John and Charles were realizing that the church, though different in other places than it was in Epworth, the church really wasn't that relevant to the life of its members. It didn't seem to be alive. The faith didn't seem to be alive. You were a member of the Church of England, but were you following Christ? There was really no evidence of that in most people's lives, it seemed.
It had become sort of perfunctory.
Right.
If you go, a few times a year, receive communion, baptize your child at the right time, that was really the limit of what was expected of
right.
a member
You
of the
were
church.
in good standing with the church. But they wanted more. And so at Oxford, they formed a holy club, is what they called it. And they were very organized in what they did. They would get up very early in the morning and meet together, John and Charles and several others that would be in school with Charles. And John led them, and they would get together, and they would share the sacrament of Holy Communion together in the morning, and then they would read Scripture together, and then they would pray together, and on some days they would go out and work in an orphanage together, or they would go and gather food to take to the widows together, or they would actually go out, and when people were being sent to the gallows for capital punishment, they would ride in the wagon with them and pray with them and try to give them comfort as they were going to die. And they were very, very methodical about this.
And the priests in Oxford would get tired of them because they would come for communion every day.
Every day.
Not, the rote way that most people did just because that's what you're supposed to do. But it really was this meaningful thing that kept driving them over and over and over to show up to receive daily communion.
Absolutely. And so people started, well, as would happen on a college campus when things like this occur, people started making fun of them. They nicknamed them different things. Some called them Bible moths because every time they turned around, a member of this group had their Bible out and they were reading Scripture. And so they said they were always flitting around the Bible like a moth flitters around a flame. And so they're Bible moths, and they called them sacramentarians because they went every day to take Holy Communion. They also, because of John's influence, they called them Methodist because they were so methodical. And I'm really glad that that's the one that stuck because, telling people, well, I'm a Bible moth. That,
Right.
I don't think it's catchy.
Right.
And and really think about.
The initials for that don't work out either.
No, it really doesn't. And the marketing is going to be horrible
It
for
is.
this.
It
And
is.
so
Methodist was
much better. And so John and Charles experienced this in this powerful way, and it changes their lives in their understanding of what it means to be a Christian. And through several events that occur, they eventually get to this place where they realize that God loves them and is calling them and has forgiven them their sin, and they want to live this life of faith. But then they don't want to live it just themselves. They want everybody to experience God in this real way. I mean, after they have gone to a Bible study on Aldersgate Street, and John has really committed himself to this, he wants everyone at that time in England, in the Church of England, to do this. And so, like Luther had been a reformer and others had been reformers, John wants to reform the Church of England. And so he begins going out, preaching everywhere, and organizing people into holy clubs.
And he wants people to live a holy life, but the model to do that was you entered a monastery or you became a nun, and you cloistered yourself away from the world, and that gave you time to do things that were holy. And so holy people lived behind walls somewhere.
Right.
They said, no, it's possible to live out this life of holiness, not behind a wall, but in everyday life.
Yeah.
That everyday people should be able to have that kind of relationship with God. And so they made it their life endeavor to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, they formed, they would go and preach to large groups, but they knew that the gathering with the large group was one thing. They knew that kind of holy life came from that the smaller group relationship. And so everywhere they went, they formed the holy club that they called the class. You would have a class, and it would have 12 or 13 people in it, and you would gather once a week together with your class, and you would ask each other questions and hold each other accountable. You would pray together. If there was a minister that was visiting with you, you would have communion together. But then Wesley said, but you need a smaller group, that you really hold each other accountable and really support each other in this walk. And so he formed bands. And so that would be made up of maybe only 4 or 5 people. And you would get together once a week with your band. And so you were holding each other accountable to live and to live for Christ, to serve for Christ, to love like Christ loved. And slowly, this reform movement began to grow, and then it picked up speed and kept picking up speed until the Church of England got very disturbed about it. And so John and Charles, neither one were allowed to preach in the Church of England any longer, but they were preaching outside anyway. And it just kept growing, and they had to form their own preaching houses, churches. And so you have a new room in Bristol, and then City Road in London, which is now Wesley Memorial. And so you have this growth of this movement. And it's amazing how many lives were being changed, because it's not just about going to church. It's about being transformed by the gospel. And so there's some historians in England that credit Wesley with things like the creation of the middle class in England, because Wesley started showing people that how not only just to follow the gospel, but to how to be a good steward of all God placed in their care. And so they were earning all they could by legal means, and they were saving all they could, and then they were giving all they could. But they were rising up out of this sort of squalor into a better life.
And they both had musical abilities, and they understood how kind of the up-and-coming middle class lived. They didn't know the hymns of the church that well, but they knew the songs that they heard in the bars.
Yeah, if you only go to the church maybe 3 or 4 times a year, you don't really know that music. When you hit the pub,
Maybe
three or four nights a week,
Yeah,
you know.
you're going to know some of those songs. And so they would take the tunes, change the words, and suddenly this whole new genre of music begins to be a part of the Methodist movement. And again, they're going to where the people are. The preaching points are where the people are. The music is where the people are. Rather than saying, y'all got to come here, they began to take the good news of the gospel to where the folks were.
That's right. And, and so you have John standing in the square of a village and everybody coming out. They said people would close their shops and leave their farms to go hear John preach. Or you would come up out of a mine. And as soon as your eyes would clear and you would start being able to see again as you come out of the darkness of the mine, there's this very short-statured preacher standing on a stump waiting on you to preach to you and to share the message of Christ with you. And he would get people in the pit mines where he could stand above and his voice would carry out. And everywhere the people were, he would go. And how he needed to share the gospel, he would. And that he would take it, and it would be in classes and bands, in society meetings, in preaching houses, whatever needed to happen to help people live out the gospel. That was what was important to John. And of course, all of this is happening in the same period of time when the world is shifting. And people are moving to America from England, and they're settling in the colonies and expanding the colonies. And the Church of England is the most established religion in America at the time. And, well, as people are moving over, they're also Methodists moving over.
Because they would still be members of the Church of England.
The Church of England, right.
Because they would encourage them to go there on Sunday, receive the sacraments, have your children baptized, but they would also go to the meeting houses at different times of the week to experience Bible studies and what really small groups as we know them, life groups as we know them, were invented by the Wesleys. And so they would experience those. And that model worked fine until the American Revolution.
You have an issue then.
Yeah, because John, though he had humble beginnings, by the time he got to the end of his life, he had friends in high places.
He did.
And he was friends with King George. And so the Methodists in America, as you start seeing this patriotic fervor, look back at the Wesleys and go, but they are still priests in the Church of England. They were till they died. And were really opposed to the revolution. They felt like it was more of a rebellion.
Like most people in England,
yeah.
They didn't understand it, and so the Revolutionary War happens, and during that period of time, you have Wesley calls home most preachers that wanted to come home. He allowed them to come back to England, or encouraged them to come back to England. People that were preaching in the Methodist movement, which, remember, is still a reform movement for the Church of England. But one minister who had immigrated from England to America was a very young man. He was in his early 20s when he came to America. His name was Francis Asbury, and Asbury was one of those who said he didn't want to go back to England.
Wait. Is there a church named after him?
I think so. I think there's actually a few.
Maybe more than one.
Maybe more than one. I think there's quite a few.
Yeah.
But yeah, he came to America as a young man. He didn't want to go back where he had grown up in England. It was very poor. He was here. He was basically a lay preacher. He was not ordained. He was just a preacher someone who had taken up the act of preaching. And so when all the other ministers went home, Asbury was here, and Asbury was writing every day to different towns and villages as the Revolutionary War, raged on. Asbury would go around the battles to get to different places so that he could continue the Methodist movement. He could continue sharing the gospel and taking that message of hope to people all across the country, all through the colonies. Well, the Revolutionary War ends. England lost. The Church of England also lost because it's now, in essence, dead in America, but there's still Methodists here. And Wesley realizes that though he is still a priest in the Church of England, so is Charles. And though he didn't really understand, the issues of the revolution were not his issues necessarily, he knew that the Methodists in America needed their own church. They could no longer be a reform movement. And so he decided...
They were having babies.
Oh, yeah.
They needed communion.
Right.
They needed all the things that a church provided with pastoral leadership.
And they no longer had the ability to baptize. They didn't have the ability to have communion because you don't have clergy anymore and you don't have structure. And so Wesley decides, it was a very difficult decision for him, but Wesley decides to start a church. And Charles is adamantly opposed to this. And Wesley decides he would do it. And so he brings together Thomas Coke, Richard Vasey, and Robert Watcote. He brings them to his house, and he lays hands on them, and he ordains them deacons, and he makes them elders, and then they lay hands on Coke, and they make him a general secretary, a general superintendent, rather. A general superintendent, and he's supposed to come to America with the goal of finding Asbury and creating a church. And so he sends them off to America, and then he tells Charles that he's starting a denomination. And of course, Charles was irate about this. It's one of the times when the two brothers distance themselves from each other for a little bit, then reconcile and continue in ministry together. But Thomas Coke comes to America. He finds Asbury.
And that's where we get the term Cokesbury.
Cokesbury, the combination of the two names.
Those names.
He finds Asbury, and in Baltimore, Maryland, at Lovely Lane Chapel, in Christmas Eve of 1784, they ordain Francis Asbury a deacon of the church. They ordain Francis Asbury an elder of the church, and then they consecrate Asbury as a bishop of the church. And so he is the second general superintendent. Coke was the first, and so Bishop Coke was our first bishop, Bishop Asbury our second. And Francis Asbury was truly a pioneer of the Methodist faith in America and shared it in tremendous ways. Wesley and Charles both died. John Wesley and Charles Wesley both died as priests in the Church of England. The British Methodist Church did not form until after their death. They would not allow it to form until after their death. And Charles precedes John in death, and John dies a few years later in the 1790s. But John and Charles Wesley were truly, they were amazing leaders because they were willing to do whatever was need to be done to carry the gospel forward. They never forgot the prime directive. They never forgot the reason for what they did, the why of what they did. Why did they do what they did? Because they wanted people to have a life of faith. They wanted people to be transformed by the gospel.
They didn't forget where they came from.
No.
Which was this dead religious history that was not an alive experience. And so they would do whatever they could to get people, to draw people into that living, breathing relationship with Christ.
Right.
And so they did it through music. They did it through small groups. They did it through being where the people were. And it would be fascinating to see what their opinion would be of what the church ought to be doing today, or if we could have John Wesley come to speak to one of our Sunday school classes or to our church. Where would he be? Where would he tell us that we ought to be going or doing what we ought to be doing? Because they were always innovative, always asking, "What's the next thing that we can do?"
Yeah, I mean, I think of the fact that our people know the hymns of the church now, and they sing the hymns of the church well. And I think Wesley would be happy with that and be very thrilled with that. But I also think Wesley would have embraced the idea of contemporary worship, because Charles did the same thing. He took religious texts and put it to more secular tune. And so I think they would have approved that. I think the idea of online worship would be something that they would have been fascinated by and embraced, because wherever you are in the world, they could carry the gospel. And Wesley said when they exited him from the pulpit and said he couldn't preach in the Church of England any longer, when he couldn't preach at Oxford anymore, his school, he said, well, the world is my parish. With online worship, the world literally could be John's parish. He could preach in all parts of the world at the same time. So I think that that idea of the Methodist movement, more than the Methodist established church, I think the idea of the Methodist movement still is so powerful. The idea that we will go out into the world, we will go out into our community, we'll go into our families and our friends, wherever we may be, to carry the gospel and to help people be transformed by the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's exciting, to be part of the Methodist movement that John started.
Absolutely.